Social media platforms want the best of both worlds.
Rules for holding digital platforms accountable.
77,000 Rs per month.
The National Congress decided to vote on salary increases for congressional employees.
This year, the Workers' Party received 615 million raise from the Electoral Fund.
There is a well-known metaphor in political science and psychology. If you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it will jump out immediately. But if you put the same frog in cold water and gradually heat it up, it won't notice the change until it's too late. That's exactly how great individual freedoms are taken away from a society. They don't disappear overnight with tanks in the streets or loud authoritarian proclamations. They are undermined in a slow, gradual, and bureaucratic process. Article by article, decree by decree, under the constant justification of protecting the common good, social justice, or the defense of democracy. In recent decades, in Brazil, especially under the consolidation of governments with a strong tendency towards state centralization and the hegemony of the Workers' Party, as well as the continuous strengthening of the state apparatus, Congress, the process of reincarnation, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and the sanctity of private property. What many classify as social advances is interpreted by liberal and conservative jurists and analysts as a systematic encroachment on the autonomy of the citizen. In today's video, we are going to analyze data, articles, legal frameworks, and historic decisions to understand how the Brazilian state has tightened its grip on the average citizen. And since this is extremely important and you need to know about it, even to protect your assets and most importantly your family, grab your boiled banana with cheese, that good cup of coffee, and some toasted bread, and let's start our segment, Señores do Mundo. Señores do Mundo. Let's start with the central pillar of any free society, freedom of expression. Article 5 of the Federal Constitution of 1988 is clear in prohibiting any kind of political, ideological, or artistic censorship in the country. However, in recent practice, we have seen the creation of flexible and legally indeterminate concepts that have weakened this fundamental guarantee. Over the years of left-wing governments in Brazil, the concept of social control of the media has always been part of the official program of the Workers' Party, PT. For a long time, there were attempts to implement journalism councils and content regulatory bodies, which in the past faced strong resistance from the traditional press. Today, it reemerges in a modern guise, under the pretext of fighting so-called disinformation, in quotes, and so-called hate speech, also in quotes. We saw the advancement of law proposals such as Bill 2630, known as the Fake News Bill, and pejoratively the End of the World Bill, which seeks to create obligations for digital platforms and grant power to state bodies or regulatory agencies to define what is true and what is false, as if someone had the power of God himself. When the state takes on the role of arbiter of truth, the consequence is that freedom of thought ceases to exist and becomes just a license granted by the government to whomever it wants. Literally, today you can see several examples that it's not about what you say, but who you are and what you stand for. If you're a friend of the king, you can do anything. If you're against him, you can't do anything. Single judge decisions that block the profiles of parliamentarians, journalists, and citizens without due process of law. The demonetization of independent outlets and the creation of the Secretariat for the Defense of Democracy by the Attorney General's Office are hallmarks of an environment where political dissent starts to be treated as a crime against the nation. Gradually, self-censorship sets in. The average citizen starts to be afraid of expressing their political opinions on the internet. You who follow our channel know that there are many words we have to bleep out or simply change the terms to words that are often ridiculous. But either you do it this way or the video doesn't get through. And even when you do this and it gets through, we notice that it reaches far fewer people. But why would a platform do this with topics that people want to hear about? For that, we need to understand the second essential pillar for human freedom and economic prosperity, which is the right to private property. Without the guarantee that the fruit of your labor and your property belong to you inalienably, there is no security, neither legal security nor incentive for production. Maybe you find it difficult to connect these two things. But if you are not the owner of what is yours, my brothers, how are you going to have autonomy? How are you really going to have freedom? Especially if you depend on the state or the income they create. That's why so many people support the Workers' Party, despite so many scandals that have already happened and continue to happen, involving corruption and great destruction of our own country. In Brazil, property rights have been steadily eroded under the justification of the so-called social function of property, in quotes. Left-wing governments have prioritized leniency and, at times, even explicit and financial support for land occupation and invasion movements in rural and urban areas. But those people who thought, yeah, but I left the countryside a long time ago, the ones who lived on a farm were my grandparents or great-great-grandparents, are mistaken. But, as I say, my brothers, when you let something absurd happen to a group of people and you don't care just because you think you don't belong to them, you forget how these authorities have looked at us. Good sources of income, and if it hasn't reached you yet, it will reach you sooner or later. Eventually, it hits you too. So, the advance wasn't limited to the rural area. Now, those people who felt safe because they were in the cities are starting to see trouble coming in. We see municipal and state laws becoming increasingly aggressive regarding urban properties. Recent reports from regional news portals that covered local legislation reveal how city halls and governments have created mechanisms to take possession of properties and land, claiming abandonment or non-compliance. Failure to fulfill its social function, reducing the owner's defense period to 30 days under the threat of permanent loss of the property. That's right, my brother. If you worked, sweated, fought to buy something and planned one day to build a house for rent, a warehouse, or something like that, this property can be expropriated from you. If it doesn't comply, even if you do build, what they call its social function is literally at the mercy of whatever judge happens to be there in your city's courthouse. When the state arrogates the right to decide whether private property is being well used or not and makes bureaucratic confiscation of properties easier, private property ceases to be an absolute right and becomes a precarious concession from the government. Add to this progressive inheritance taxes and the constant threat of taxation on large fortunes and government debt, which devalues the currency through inflation, which is nothing more than the silent confiscation of your purchasing power. We then arrive at the third fundamental right. It has been eroded, and it is the right to move freely, the freedom of movement, guaranteed in Item 15 of Article 5 of the Constitution. The right to move freely throughout the national territory in times of peace is the foundation of an individual's physical freedom. The most dangerous precedent for this right occurred during the recent pandemic period, when state and municipal authorities imposed severe lockdowns, curfews, and health checkpoints without the proper backing of a state of siege, which would be the only valid constitutional instrument to restrict such a right, and which requires approval from the National Congress. Citizens were prevented from working, going to the beach, or even walking in public squares, establishing an alarming legal precedent. The idea that fundamental rights can be suspended by the stroke of a pen from governors and mayors during exceptional times is simply absurd. Besides the physical aspect, freedom of movement is indirectly eroded through economic and regulatory means. The continuous increase in the tax burden on fuels, the rising cost of transportation, and the constant attempts at over-regulating mobility apps that threaten to make the service unfeasible for millions of workers. And the increase in punitive inspections creates financial barriers to citizens' mobility. The more the state makes transportation expensive and centralizes decisions about who can and cannot circulate or work on the streets, the less real independence citizens have from central power. When we connect these 3 points, these 3 pillars, the limitation of speech, the relativization of property, and the restriction of mobility, we see the clear outline of a bid for power. the establishment of the paternalistic state. It is a worldview in which the citizen is seen as incapable of managing his own life, educating his children, choosing his readings, or managing his finances. The state, under the guise of socialist paternalism, presents itself as the only entity capable of providing security, equality, and justice. Historically, governments aligned with the PT and the South American left-wing ecosystem have adopted the tactic of taking control of public institutions. New ministries are created, privileges for the state bureaucracy are increased, and an extensive network of NGOs and social movements is subsidized, which function as lines of defense for the government itself. This economic dependence, created by the expansion of state subsidies while stifling free enterprise, creates a perfect trap. The citizen becomes so dependent on the state for survival that he loses the ability to criticize it or to demand the return of his individual freedoms. Freedom is rarely lost all at once in a catastrophic event. It is given up little by little in exchange for the promise of security, convenience, or state protection. As Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We do not pass it to our children in our blood. It needs to be fought for, protected, and handed to them so they can do the same. If we want to preserve Brazil as a nation of free men and women, we need to remain vigilant against the silent advance of regulations, the expansion of the punitive power of the state, and the erosion of constitutional guarantees. The first step to defending freedom is to understand how it is being taken from us. If you understand this, my dear brother, please share it. Show it to more people. If we make the mistake of staying trapped in our own bubble, just talking among ourselves, we will be dominated. The left uses artists, those artists, platforms, soap operas, TV series, journalists, influencers, and whatever else they can find. All of this is for their cause. They fund NGOs, have big companies sponsoring this kind of thing. And we, on the other hand, only have ourselves. So please, share this. Show it to more people. This is how we're going to make a difference. I also ask you to leave a comment, even if it's just an emoji, but leave it there. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to like. Give a big like. And if you want to become a member, that also helps a lot. I thank everyone, and by becoming a member, you'll get exclusive content. That's it for today. May God bless each one of you. Thank you for being here. Hugs, and always facing the supernatural here on Encarando o Sobrenatural Official.